The bullet grazed his shoulder before he even heard the shot, and Wade Zimmer spun into the alley with his revolver already drawn, firing twice into the smoke before the drunken miners even knew what hit them. Blood trickled down his arm as he holstered his gun and kept walking through Owyhee's muddy Main Street like nothing had happened, ignoring the stares and the whispers that followed him everywhere he went in this Nevada mining town. It was 1876, and Wade had earned his reputation the hard way, with fists and bullets and a cold stare that made even hardened prospectors cross to the other side of the street. He was 26 years old and had already killed 3 men in fair fights, though the good people of Owyhee didn't care much about fairness when they clutched their children closer as he passed. The ladies' auxiliary had stopped inviting him to church socials after he'd broken a man's jaw at the last one for insulting a Chinese laundryman. The school teacher had actually fainted when he'd helped her carry books last spring, and the mayor had made it perfectly clear that while Wade's gun might be useful when bandits came calling, his presence at respectable gatherings was not welcome. Wade told himself he didn't care, that he preferred the company of his horse and a bottle of whiskey to their sanctimonious tea parties and forced smiles. He pushed through the doors of the Silver Strike Saloon just as the afternoon sun began its descent behind the Owyhee Mountains, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded him of the bruises he'd worn as a boy. The bartender, a grizzled man named Pete who'd lost an eye in a mine collapse, nodded at him and poured whiskey without being asked. "Heard you had trouble with the Morrison boys," Pete said, sliding the glass across the scarred wooden bar. "Nothing I couldn't handle." Wade downed the whiskey in one swallow, feeling it burn away the ache in his shoulder. The wound was shallow, barely more than a scratch, but his shirt was ruined. "That made 4 this month. Sheriff's been asking about you. Sheriff can come find me himself if he's got something to say." Wade poured himself another drink from the bottle Pete left on the bar. "I was defending myself. Half the town saw them draw first. Don't matter what half the town saw. Matters what the respectable half thinks, and they think you're trouble." Pete wiped down the bar with a rag that looked like it had never been clean. "Mark my words, Wade. You keep this up, they'll find a way to run you out of town, no matter how fast you are with that gun." Wade didn't answer because Pete was right, and they both knew it. He'd been run out of towns before, from Sacramento to Virginia City, always for the same reason. He was too rough, too quick to anger, too willing to use his fists when words would do. His father had beaten the softness out of him before he was 10, and the years since had only added more sharp edges. He didn't know how to be the kind of man women wanted at their dinner tables, and he'd stopped trying somewhere along the way. The saloon doors swung open, and Wade glanced up out of habit, his hand drifting toward his gun. But it wasn't the sheriff or angry miners looking for revenge. It was a woman, and even through the smoke and dim light, Wade could see she didn't belong here. She stood in the doorway like she'd stumbled into the wrong world entirely, wearing a traveling dress of deep green that had probably been fine once, but now bore the dust of hard miles. Her dark hair was pinned up in a style that suggested money and breeding, though several strands had come loose to frame a face that might have been beautiful if it wasn't so completely devoid of expression. She looked at the room full of rough men and spittoons and card tables like she was looking at absolutely nothing at all. "Madam," Pete called out, his voice gentler than Wade had heard in months. "I think you might have the wrong place. If you're looking for the hotel, it's 3 buildings down." She didn't seem to hear him. Her dark eyes swept the room with that same blank stare, and Wade felt something uncomfortable twist in his chest. He'd seen that look before, on men who'd been in too many battles, who'd seen things that hollowed them out from the inside. He'd seen it in his own mirror on the worst nights. "I am looking for employment," she said, her voice clear and educated, with an accent that suggested Boston or Philadelphia. "I was told that establishments such as this sometimes need help with cooking or cleaning." The saloon went quiet. Even the card players stopped mid-deal to stare. A woman like this, walking into a saloon in broad daylight and asking for work, might as well have announced she was from the moon. Pete recovered first, his face softening with something like pity. "Madam, we don't really need that kind of help here. But Mrs. Henderson, who runs the boarding house, could use someone. Why don't you head over there and tell her Pete sent you?" "I have already inquired at the boarding house, the hotel, the restaurant, and both general stores. No one is hiring." She said it without inflection, like she was reading from a shopping list. "I have $17 remaining and no prospects. Therefore, I am expanding my search." Wade found himself standing before he'd made a conscious decision to do so. Something about the way she stood there, so straight-backed and proper while asking for work in a saloon, made him angry in a way he couldn't quite name. Angry at the world that put that emptiness in her eyes, angry at whatever had brought her so low, angry at himself for caring. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. She turned those dead eyes on him, and he had to force himself not to look away. "Penelope Caldwell, formerly of Philadelphia. You got any skills besides being respectable, Miss Caldwell?" He knew he sounded harsh, but something in him wanted to crack that blank facade, wanted to see any kind of real emotion cross her face. "I can read, write, keep accounts, play piano, speak French, and organize social events." She paused. "I do not believe any of those skills are particularly valuable in Owyhee, Nevada. Can you cook adequately? Can you clean? I have never had to, but I imagine I could learn. Can you shoot?" For the first time, something flickered behind her eyes. "No." Wade didn't know what possessed him, what momentary insanity made him open his mouth and say the words he knew he'd regret. Maybe it was the way she stood there like she had nothing left to lose, or maybe it was the whiskey, or maybe he was just tired of being alone in his anger. "I've got a small ranch about 3 miles outside town. Nothing fancy, just some cattle and horses. I could use someone to help with the cooking and keeping the place from falling into complete disrepair. Pay would be room, board, and $10 a month." Pete's eye went wide. Several of the card players started muttering among themselves. A woman alone with Wade Zimmer at his ranch. That was more scandalous than her walking into a saloon. "Your reputation would be completely ruined," Wade continued, maintaining that emotionless stare. "Whatever respectability you got left would be gone the second you rode out there with me. The good people of this town would never accept you again." "I do not believe I have any respectability left to lose, mister." She waited for him to provide his name. "Zimmer. Wade Zimmer." More muttering from the card players. Someone laughed, low and mean. Pete shook his head like he was watching a disaster unfold and couldn't stop it. "Mr. Zimmer," she said with the same inflection she might use for any formal introduction, "I accept your offer. When would you like me to begin?" "You understand what you're agreeing to. You'd be living out there, just the two of us. People will talk. They'll assume things." "People have already assumed things about me, Mr. Zimmer. Their assumptions have ceased to concern me." She adjusted the small traveling bag she carried. "I simply need employment and a place to sleep. If you are offering both, then I accept, regardless of what the citizens of Owyhee choose to believe." Wade studied her for a long moment, looking for any sign that she understood what she was walking into. He was the most disreputable man in town, and she was about to tie her fate to his. But those empty eyes just stared back at him, and he realized she genuinely didn't care. Whatever had happened to her, it had burned away her concern for social niceties. "Get whatever belongings you got from the hotel. I'll meet you outside in 10 minutes with a horse." He threw some coins on the bar to settle his tab. "And Miss Caldwell, where I live, you'll need to learn to shoot. The desert's not kind to people who can't defend themselves." She nodded once, precise and proper, then turned and walked out of the saloon with her back straight and her head high, even as the muttering behind her grew louder. Wade watched her go and wondered what the hell he'd just done. He'd spent years carefully maintaining his solitude, keeping people at arm's length where they couldn't disappoint him or demand things he didn't know how to give. And now he'd just invited a broken stranger into his home. Pete leaned across the bar, his voice low. "You've lost your mind. That woman's got trouble written all over her, and you've got enough problems without adding a mysterious widow to the mix. She didn't say she was a widow. She's wearing black under that traveling dress and she's got the look. Whatever happened, it wasn't good." Pete shook his head again. "And when the town finds out you're keeping a woman out at your place, respectable or not, you can forget about that last thread of tolerance you've been hanging by." Never asked for their tolerance. Wade headed for the door, his shoulder throbbing where the bullet had grazed it. "And she needs help. Since when do you help people?" Wade paused in the doorway, silhouetted against the fading desert light. "Since never. Maybe that's the problem." He walked to the livery stable and paid for the rental of a gentle mare, ignoring the stable boy's curious stares. Then he saddled his own horse, a big black gelding named Trouble that suited both his temperament and his reputation. By the time he led both horses back to the saloon, Penelope Caldwell was waiting on the wooden sidewalk with a single small trunk that looked like it had seen better days. "This is everything?" Wade asked, lifting the trunk easily despite his injured shoulder and securing it behind his saddle. "I traveled light when I left Philadelphia. I have traveled even lighter since." She looked at the mare with something that might have been apprehension under all that blankness. "I should inform you that my experience with horses is limited to brief carriage rides. She's gentle. Her name's Daisy, and she'll follow Trouble without much encouragement." He helped her mount, noting how stiffly she sat in the saddle. "Just hold on to the pommel and try to move with her. It's only 3 miles. They rode out of town as the sun touched the horizon, painting the desert in shades of crimson and gold. Wade was acutely aware of the eyes watching them go, the curtains twitching in windows, the conversations that would be happening over dinner tables throughout Owyhee tonight. He just made both their situations significantly worse, but when he glanced back at Penelope Caldwell swaying awkwardly in the saddle, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. The ride took longer than usual because Daisy had to walk slowly for Penelope's benefit. Wade used the time to study his new employee, looking for clues about what had happened to her. She was probably around 23 or 24, young enough that her life shouldn't be over yet, but something had clearly convinced her otherwise. The dress under her traveling coat was indeed black, though worn and faded. No rings on her fingers, but there was a pale band of skin on her left hand that suggested there had been one recently. "How long since you left Philadelphia?" he asked as they followed the rough trail into the hills. 6 months. She gripped the pommel tighter as Daisy navigated a rocky section. "Perhaps 7. The days have blurred together. That's a long time to be traveling." "I was not traveling the entire time. I stopped in various cities seeking employment. My funds depleted more quickly than I anticipated." She said it all in that same flat voice, like she was discussing the weather. "Owyhee is the 4th town I have tried in Nevada alone." "Why Nevada?" "It is very far from Philadelphia." Wade understood that reasoning better than he wanted to admit. "You got family back east. No longer. Something in her voice suggested the topic was closed, and Wade let it drop. His ranch appeared as they crested a small rise, and he saw it through her eyes and felt a moment of embarrassment. The house was small and rough, built from local timber and stone, with a porch that sagged on one end and a roof that probably leaked when it rained. The barn was in better shape, but only because he cared more about his animals than his own comfort. A few cattle grazed in the fenced pasture, and chickens scratched in the yard with the determined optimism of birds who hadn't yet been eaten by coyotes. "It is not much," Penelope observed, though without judgment. "No, it's not, but it's mine and it's got 4 walls and a roof." He dismounted and helped her down, noting how her legs trembled after the short ride. "You'll get used to the saddle after a few days. The soreness passes." He led her inside, suddenly seeing the place through the eyes of a woman from Philadelphia high society. Dust covered every surface. Dirty dishes were piled in the wash basin. His clothes were scattered across the floor like he'd shed them and walked away. The fireplace was full of ashes that should have been cleaned out weeks ago. It smelled like sweat and wood smoke and the lonely existence of a man who'd stopped caring about such things. "I see why you need help," Penelope said, and for just a moment there might have been the ghost of humor in her voice. "Your room's through there." He pointed to a door on the far side of the main room. "It's small, but it's got a bed and a window. I'll sleep out here on the settee." "That is unnecessary. I assume you have been sleeping in that room and I have no wish to displace you." "You're not." "I usually fall asleep out here anyway after drinking." He realized how that sounded and felt heat creep up his neck. "Which I'm trying to do less of." She walked to the door and looked into the small bedroom, and Wade wondered what she was thinking behind that expressionless mask. The room was probably a disaster too, but at least the bed was sturdy, built by his own hands from local pine. "I will clean this tomorrow," she announced, turning back to face him. "But I confess I am extremely tired. Would it be acceptable if I simply went to sleep now and began my duties in the morning?" "You don't have to ask permission. You're not a servant, Miss Caldwell. You're an employee, and this is your home now, too." He moved toward the door. "I'll bring your trunk in and then leave you be. There's a latch on the inside if you want privacy." Something crossed her face then, quick as lightning. Relief, maybe, or gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Zimmer. Call me Wade. We're past formalities if we're going to be living under the same roof. Then you may call me Penelope." She paused in the doorway, silhouetted against the lamplight. "And Wade, whatever the people of Owyhee believe about this arrangement, I want you to know that I do not expect or desire anything beyond employment. My heart is not available and my person is not negotiable. If you had other intentions, I should know now." Wade felt his jaw tighten. "I'm a lot of things, Penelope, but I'm not the kind of man who'd pressure a woman under his roof. You're safe here. I give you my word." She studied him for a long moment, and he got the sense she was seeing past his rough exterior to something underneath. Finally, she nodded. "I believe you. Thank you." She closed the door, and Wade stood in the disaster of his main room, wondering again what he'd gotten himself into. Then he went outside to care for the horses, because animals were simpler than people, and didn't look at you with dead eyes that made you want to fix things you didn't know how to fix. The next morning, Wade woke to the smell of coffee and something cooking, which was so unusual he reached for his gun before remembering he had a house guest. He sat up on the settee where he'd spent an uncomfortable night and found Penelope in the kitchen area, already dressed in a plain gray work dress he hadn't seen the night before. Her hair was pinned up severely, and she was stirring something in a pot over the fire. "I found oatmeal in your pantry, along with some dried apples and cinnamon," she said without turning around. I apologize if this was meant for something else, but it seemed like appropriate breakfast fare. That's fine. Wade stood and stretched, feeling his shoulder pull. The wound had scabbed over during the night. You didn't have to start working so early. I am an early riser by nature, and I prefer to be busy. She ladled oatmeal into 2 bowls with the efficiency of someone used to tasks, despite her claim that she'd never done housework. I should warn you that while I said I could cook adequately, my experience is limited to what I observed cooks preparing in my family home. My practical knowledge is largely theoretical. Wade took the bowl she offered and tried a spoonful. It was actually good, better than anything he'd made for himself in months. Tastes fine to me. They ate in silence, and Wade found himself stealing glances at her. In the morning light coming through the windows, he could see the exhaustion carved into her face, the shadows under her eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. But there was something else too, something in the determined set of her jaw that suggested she'd been a fighter once, before whatever happened to break her. I will need you to explain your expectations, Penelope said, setting down her empty bowl. I assume you require meals, cleaning, and laundry. Are there other duties you expect? Help with the animals sometimes when I need an extra pair of hands. Maybe tending a garden if you're interested, though the desert's not kind to growing things. He finished his coffee. Mostly I just need the place kept livable and food that doesn't come from a can. I'm not a demanding employer. I will do my best. She stood and began gathering the dishes. When would you like your lessons in shooting to begin? Wade had almost forgotten about that. You serious about learning? You said the desert is not kind to those who cannot defend themselves. I see no reason to remain helpless if an alternative exists. She started heating water for washing dishes. I have very little left in this world, Wade, but I still prefer to remain alive. There was something in how she said it, like staying alive was a choice she was actively making rather than a given, that made Wade's chest tighten. This afternoon, then. I've got to ride out and check the herd this morning, but when I get back, we'll start. He left her washing dishes and headed out to tend the horses, but his mind stayed on the woman in his kitchen. What had happened to Penelope Caldwell to strip away everything except that stubborn core that kept her putting one foot in front of the other? And why did he care so much about someone he'd just met? The morning passed in the familiar rhythm of ranch work. He checked the cattle, mended a section of fence that had come loose, and hunted down a chicken that had gotten ambitious and wandered too far from the coop. When he returned to the house around noon, he stopped short in surprise. The main room had been transformed. The floors were swept, the surfaces dusted, the dishes washed and put away. His clothes had been gathered into a neat pile with a note on top in elegant handwriting. Please indicate where these should be stored. The windows had been cleaned, letting in more light than he'd seen in months, and the fireplace ashes had been carried out. Fresh wildflowers stood in a jar on the table, bright spots of color in the rough space. Penelope emerged from the bedroom, dusty and slightly disheveled, more alive-looking than she'd been since he'd met her. I hope you do not mind that I threw out several items that seemed beyond repair. I found what I believed to be a root cellar outside, but I was not certain it was safe to enter alone. Wade turned in a slow circle, taking in the transformation. You did all this in one morning. I find physical labor helps quiet the mind. She brushed dust from her sleeves. Though I confess I am not accustomed to such exertion. My muscles are protesting vigorously. You should rest. I would prefer to learn to shoot if the offer still stands. She met his eyes, and he saw determination burning in those dark depths. Please, Wade, I need to know how. He understood that need in a bone-deep way, so he nodded and went to fetch his spare revolver from the locked box under his bed. It was lighter than his preferred weapon, better suited for smaller hands. He checked it carefully before bringing it out to where Penelope waited on the porch. They walked out behind the barn where he'd set up targets before for practice. The desert stretched away in all directions, harsh and beautiful under the afternoon sun. Wade showed her how to hold the gun, how to line up the sight, how to squeeze rather than pull the trigger. "It is heavier than I expected," Penelope said, holding the unloaded weapon awkwardly. "That's good. Means you'll respect it." He stood behind her, adjusting her grip, and caught the faint scent of lavender soap. "A gun is a tool, but it's a tool for killing. You never point it at anything you're not willing to destroy. Understand?" "Yes." Her voice was steady despite the tremor in her hands. They spent an hour on basic handling before he let her load and fire. The first shot went wildly off target, and the recoil nearly knocked her backwards, but she set her jaw and tried again. And again. By the time the sun started to sink toward the horizon, she'd managed to hit the target twice, and Wade found himself genuinely impressed. "You're a quick learner," he said as they walked back to the house. "I am highly motivated to not be helpless." She handed the gun back to him carefully. "Thank you for teaching me. We'll practice every day until you're comfortable. Out here, you need to be able to protect yourself when I'm not around." He locked the gun away again, already planning tomorrow's lesson. They fell into a routine over the following days. Wade would wake to coffee already brewing and breakfast cooking. He'd work the ranch while Penelope cleaned and organized, transforming his rough bachelor existence into something that resembled an actual home. In the afternoons, they'd practice shooting until her hands grew steady and her aim improved. Evenings, they'd eat together and talk in brief, careful conversations that revealed little but suggested much. Wade learned that she'd been married, that her husband had died along with their infant daughter in a cholera outbreak, and that her husband's family had blamed her for surviving when they had not. He learned that she'd been turned out with nothing, her inheritance contested by in-laws who'd never approved of her. He learned that she'd tried desperately to find respectable work back east, but a widow with no family and no references was worse than worthless in Philadelphia society. "They looked at me like I was already dead," she said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge. "Like I was a ghost who had failed to notice she should disappear. After a while, I began to feel like one." Wade found himself telling her things too, stories he'd never shared with anyone, about his father's fists and his mother's early death, about learning that violence was the only language some men understood, about the loneliness of being someone everyone feared but no one wanted. "I tried being softer once," he admitted, staring at the dark desert. "There was a woman in Sacramento, a teacher. She was kind and sweet, and she saw something in me she thought she could redeem." He paused, the old pain still sharp. "Her family made sure I understood I wasn't good enough. When I refused to walk away, they hired men to beat sense into me. They nearly succeeded. But you survived," Penelope said softly. "Surviving's not the same as living. After that, I stopped trying to be anything other than what I am." He glanced at her, this strange, broken woman who'd stumbled into his life. "But you make me think maybe I gave up too easy." She turned to look at him, and in the starlight, her face seemed softer somehow. "You gave me a chance when no one else would. That suggests you are not nearly as rough as you pretend to be. Don't go thinking I'm something I'm not, Penelope. I'm still the man everyone in Owyhee crosses the street to avoid. Perhaps they are crossing the street to avoid their own discomfort with someone who refuses to pretend." She stood, brushing dust from her skirt. "Good night, Wade. Thank you for another shooting lesson." He watched her go inside and wondered when exactly her presence had started to feel necessary rather than strange. The house felt right with her in it, like all those years of solitude had just been waiting for someone to fill the empty spaces. But he reminded himself sternly that she'd been clear about her heart not being available, and he had no right to want more than the comfortable companionship they'd established. 2 weeks after Penelope's arrival, Wade rode into town for supplies and walked straight into trouble. The Morrison boys, recovered from their last encounter and meaner for it, were waiting outside the general store with 3 friends. "Heard you're keeping a woman out at your place, Zimmer," the eldest Morrison called out, his voice carrying down the street. "Must be nice having your own private whore." Wade's fist connected with Morrison's jaw before the man finished the insult. The fight that followed was brutal and short, 5 against 1, but Wade had been fighting his whole life and rage made him efficient. By the time Sheriff Cooper arrived, 3 men were on the ground and Wade had Morrison pinned against the wall with a forearm across his throat. "Finish it," the sheriff barked, hauling Wade back. "All of you break it up now." Wade shook off the sheriff's grip, breathing hard, his knuckles split and bleeding. "He insulted a lady." "A lady," Morrison spat blood. "She's living alone with you, Zimmer. That makes her anything but a lady." Wade lunged again, but Sheriff Cooper stepped between them. "Enough. Morrison, get yourself and your boys out of here before I arrest you for disturbing the peace." He waited until the men shuffled away, then turned to Wade. "And you, come with me." They walked to the sheriff's office, Wade following reluctantly, already knowing what was coming. Sheriff Cooper was a fair man who'd actually given Wade the benefit of the doubt more than once, but even his patience had limits. "Sit," the sheriff ordered, pointing to a chair. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey and handed one to Wade. "I'm going to talk and you're going to listen." "Can you manage that?" Wade nodded, downing the whiskey in one swallow. "You're one of the best shots in this territory, Wade. You work hard, you pay your debts, and despite what everyone says, I've never known you to start a fight you didn't have cause to finish." Sheriff Cooper leaned against his desk. "But you've got a talent for making enemies, and now you've got a woman at your place who's going to suffer for your reputation. I'm protecting her reputation. By beating up anyone who insults her, that's only going to make the talk worse." The sheriff refilled Wade's glass. "The ladies' auxiliary came to see me yesterday. They're concerned about Miss Caldwell's situation. They want to offer her a position at the church, helping with teaching and charity work. Respectable employment that would let her move into town, get out from under the shadow of living with you." Wade's grip tightened on the glass. "Did they ask her if she wanted that?" "They tried. She refused to see them." Sheriff Cooper's expression was sympathetic. "Look, I understand you're trying to help her, but the kindest thing you could do is let her go. Give her a chance at the respectable life she had before. She doesn't want that life anymore. That's why she came west." Wade stood, anger simmering under his skin. "And I'm not letting anyone run her off because they don't approve of me. Then you better be prepared for this to get worse before it gets better." The sheriff walked him to the door. "And Wade, for what it's worth, I think you did a good thing taking her in. I just hope it doesn't destroy you both in the process." Wade rode home with the sheriff's words echoing in his head and his knuckles throbbing. He found Penelope in the garden she'd started, coaxing stubborn vegetables from the reluctant earth. She looked up at his approach and went still, her eyes traveling over his split lip and bruised face. "What happened?" She set down her trowel and walked to meet him. "Men said things they shouldn't have. I corrected them." He dismounted stiffly, realizing he'd probably cracked a rib in the fight. "About me?" It wasn't a question. She reached up carefully and touched the cut on his lip. "You defended my honor. Wasn't going to let them talk about you like that." To his surprise, anger flashed across her face, real emotion breaking through that careful blankness. "So you proved them right." You proved you are exactly the violent, dangerous man they believe you to be. They insulted you, Penelope. What was I supposed to do? Not care. The words burst out of her with surprising force. Their opinions should not matter. Their small-minded judgment should not provoke you to violence. Do you not see that you are giving them exactly what they expect? Wade stepped back, stung. I was defending you. I do not need defending. Her hands had curled into fists. I need to be left alone to exist quietly without causing problems for anyone, and most especially for you. She turned away, but not before he saw tears threatening. The sheriff is right. I should go into town and take their charity position. You talked to the sheriff. He visited this morning while you were checking the cattle. He was very kind and very clear about how my presence here is damaging your already questionable reputation. She wrapped her arms around herself. I do not want to be another person who hurts you, Wade. You have been nothing but good to me. Something in Wade's chest cracked open, all the careful walls he'd built crumbling. You think I care what they say about me? I stopped caring about their opinions years ago. But you, Penelope, you've made this place feel like a home for the first time in my life. You've made me want to be better, to try harder, to believe maybe I'm not as broken as everyone says. He moved closer, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't contain. So don't go. Please don't go because of what some small-minded people think. She turned back to him, and her eyes were swimming with tears that finally spilled over. I do not know how to stay without destroying you, and I don't know how to let you go. Wade reached out slowly, carefully, and wiped away her tears with his bruised knuckles. We're both broken, Penelope. Maybe that means we're broken in ways that fit together. She made a sound between a laugh and a sob, and then she was in his arms, holding onto him like he was the only solid thing in a shifting world. Wade held her carefully despite the ache in his ribs, feeling her trembling against him, feeling the ice around both their hearts beginning to crack. I have not cried since the day they died, she whispered against his chest. I could not allow myself to feel anything because feeling meant remembering how much I had lost. I'm sorry. Wade rested his chin on top of her head, breathing in the scent of lavender and sunshine. I'm so sorry for everything you've been through. They stood there in the garden as the sun moved across the sky, holding each other through grief too long denied and loneliness too deep to measure. When Penelope finally pulled back, her face was blotchy and her eyes were red, but something had changed. The blankness was gone, replaced by raw vulnerability that was somehow more beautiful than any mask. I am terrified, she admitted. I am terrified of feeling again, of caring again, of losing again, but you make me want to try. Wade cupped her face in his rough hands, marveling at her trust. I've spent my whole life pushing people away before they could reject me. I don't know how to do this, how to be gentle when everything in my life has taught me to be hard. Perhaps we can learn together. She covered his hands with hers. Teach me to be strong again, Wade. And I will teach you that strength and gentleness are not opposites. He kissed her then, carefully, like she was something precious that might break. But she surprised him by kissing back fiercely, with all the passion she'd been holding inside, and Wade realized she wasn't fragile at all. She was steel wrapped in silk, a survivor who'd walked through fire and come out forged stronger. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Wade saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen before. Joy, real, genuine joy that transformed her face completely. Was that appropriate? She asked, and there was actual humor in her voice. I am still your employee, technically. Consider yourself promoted to companion, Wade said, and was rewarded with a sound he'd never heard from her before, laughter. It was rusty and uncertain, like she'd forgotten how, but it was real and it was wonderful. I am not certain companion is much better in terms of propriety, she pointed out, still smiling. Then we'll make you my fiancé and scandalize them properly. He said it like a joke, but the moment the words left his mouth, he realized he meant them. Marry me, Penelope. Not because it's proper or respectable, but because I want to wake up to your coffee every morning and hear you laugh every day and teach you everything I know while learning everything you can show me. Her laughter died, but her smile remained. That is perhaps the most unromantic proposal in the history of proposals. I told you I'm not good at being gentle. No, but you are good at being honest. She stood on tiptoe and kissed him again, softer this time. Yes, Wade Zimmer, I will marry you. Though I should warn you that I am very impractical and know nothing about ranching and will probably be more trouble than help. And I should warn you that I have a terrible temper and a worse reputation, and will probably embarrass you regularly in town. Then we are perfectly matched in our imperfections. She took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. When shall we do this scandalous thing? Tomorrow, if the preacher's willing. I don't want to give you time to reconsider. Tomorrow, she agreed. Though I suspect the preacher will have opinions about the haste. Reverend Walsh did indeed have opinions when they arrived at the small church the next morning. He spent 20 minutes trying to convince them to wait, to be certain, to consider the implications. But when Penelope looked him in the eye and said firmly, I have never been more certain of anything in my life, he relented with visible misgivings. The ceremony was brief and witnessed only by Sheriff Cooper and his wife Martha, who'd been summoned at the last minute and looked thoroughly bemused by the entire affair. Wade had no ring to offer, but Penelope said she preferred it that way, preferred this marriage to be nothing like her first. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Wade kissed his bride thoroughly enough to make the Reverend cough uncomfortably. Well, Martha Cooper said as they emerged into the bright morning, that will give the ladies' auxiliary something to discuss at their next meeting. Let them discuss, Penelope said, holding tight to Wade's arm. I no longer require their approval. They bought supplies and rode back to the ranch as husband and wife, and Wade felt something unfamiliar blooming in his chest. Hope, maybe, or happiness. Emotions he'd thought were broken out of him long ago. That night, as Penelope moved her few belongings into his room, now their room, Wade watched her and tried to find words for what he felt. I know this isn't what you dreamed of when you were a girl in Philadelphia. A rough rancher in the middle of nowhere. She turned to him, her expression soft in the lamplight. When I was a girl in Philadelphia, I dreamed of a proper marriage to a proper man with a proper life. I had that briefly and I loved him dearly, but that dream died with him and our daughter. She crossed to where Wade stood. What I dream of now is much simpler. Waking up without that terrible emptiness, feeling something other than numb, remembering what it is like to laugh. You have given me all of that in less than a month. So perhaps this is not the dream I started with, but it is exactly what I need. Wade pulled her close, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him. You said I should learn that strength and gentleness aren't opposites. Teach me. She smiled and led him to the bed they would now share. With pleasure, husband. Their wedding night was tender and passionate and fumbling and perfect, two broken people learning how to be whole together. When Wade woke the next morning with Penelope curled against him, her dark hair spread across his chest, he understood for the first time what it meant to belong to someone and have them belong to you. The following weeks were challenging in ways Wade hadn't anticipated. The news of their marriage spread through Owyhee like wildfire, and the reactions ranged from scandalized to furious. The ladies' auxiliary sent a delegation to save Penelope from her hasty decision, but she sent them away with such polite firmness that they didn't return. The Morrison boys made comments that resulted in another fight. though this time Wade showed more restraint and only broke one nose. But there were unexpected allies too. Sheriff Cooper made it clear that Mrs. Zimmer was to be treated with respect, or he'd personally ensure consequences. Pete from the Silver Strike Saloon started refusing service to anyone who spoke ill of Wade or his wife. And Martha Cooper, to everyone's surprise, began inviting Penelope to her weekly sewing circle, bringing 3 other women brave enough to defy social convention. "They are kind," Penelope reported after her first gathering, setting down a basket of preserves Martha had sent home with her. "A bit unsure of what to make of me, but genuinely kind." Martha asked about Philadelphia, and when I told her I preferred not to discuss it, she simply changed the subject. It was wonderfully refreshing. Wade was learning things too, like how to temper his anger before it exploded into violence, and how to use words when fists would have been easier. Penelope had a way of looking at him when he started to lose his temper, a calm, steady gaze that reminded him he was better than his worst impulses. Slowly, painfully, he began to change. "The trick," Penelope explained one evening after Wade had successfully talked his way out of a confrontation in town, "is to recognize that their judgment says more about them than about you. You have nothing to prove to small minds." "But I have everything to prove to you," Wade said, pulling her onto his lap as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "You have already proven everything that matters." She kissed his temple. "You have proven you are capable of gentleness and growth. The rest is just learning to believe it yourself." As summer deepened into fall, their life found a rhythm. The ranch prospered under their combined care. Penelope's garden yielded surprising abundance, and she learned to preserve and pickle with determined efficiency. Wade taught her to ride properly, and she began accompanying him on shorter trips to check the herd. She became proficient with the revolver, though she prayed she'd never need to use it. And slowly, carefully, Penelope began to laugh again. At first, it was just small chuckles at Wade's dry observations about the chickens' personalities or his running commentary on the ranch's various disasters. But as the weeks passed, her laughter came more easily, more often, until it became a regular music in their home. "Tell me about your daughter," Wade said one night as they lay in bed. He'd been waiting for the right moment, sensing she needed to talk about it but didn't know how to start. Penelope went still, and Wade thought perhaps he'd miscalculated. But then she took a shaky breath and began to speak. "Her name was Caroline. She had my eyes and Andrew's smile, and she was 6 months old when the cholera came through Philadelphia." Tears ran down Penelope's face, but she kept talking. "She died in my arms, and Andrew died the next day, and I survived through sheer spite, I think. His mother said it was God's judgment on me for marrying above my station. She said if I had truly loved them, I would have died too." "That's the cruelest thing I've ever heard," Wade said, holding her tighter. "For the longest time I believed her. I thought I should have died, that my survival was somehow wrong." Penelope turned to look at him, her face wet with tears but her eyes clear. "But you have taught me that surviving is not a sin, that building a new life after loss is not betrayal." "You taught me that too," Wade admitted. "I thought I was beyond saving, that the violence in me was all I had left, but you saw something worth redeeming." "Not redeeming," Penelope corrected gently. "I never wanted to redeem you, Wade. I wanted to know you, and in knowing you, I discovered you never needed redemption. You needed acceptance." They made love that night with new understanding, grief and hope tangled together, 2 survivors choosing to build rather than merely endure. Winter came to Nevada with surprising gentleness, the desert cold but the snows light. Wade taught Penelope to track in the thin snow, and she taught him to read more than just the basic letters he'd learned as a boy. They spent long evenings by the fire, Wade reading aloud from the books Penelope had carried with her from Philadelphia, stumbling over difficult words while she patiently corrected him. Christmas arrived, and they celebrated quietly, just the two of them. Wade gave Penelope a mare of her own, a pretty chestnut he'd been training for months. Penelope gave him a shirt she'd sewn herself, the stitches not quite even but made with such care that Wade felt his throat tighten. "It is not much," she said, suddenly uncertain. "I am still learning to sew properly." "It's perfect." Wade pulled it on immediately. "Best gift I've ever gotten." "Even better than the horse I assume you gave yourself when you purchased mine," Wade laughed, delighted by her teasing. "You're getting dangerously clever, wife." "I learned from the best, husband." They made love in front of the fireplace while snow fell gently outside, and Wade thought he'd never been happier in his entire rough, violent life. Spring brought changes. Martha Cooper announced she was expecting, and Penelope spent hours helping her prepare, coming home with her face alight with something Wade eventually recognized as hope. They didn't talk about it, but Wade saw the way Penelope watched Martha's growing belly, the way her hand sometimes drifted to her own flat stomach with a wistful expression. "You want children?" Wade asked one night, the question he'd been holding back for months. Penelope was quiet for a long time. "I am terrified of wanting them, terrified of loving something that completely again only to lose them." "But do you want them?" "Yes," she whispered. "God help me, yes. I want to fill this house with laughter and noise and life. I want to give you sons and daughters and watch them grow up wild and free in this desert we have come to love." Wade pulled her close, his heart full to bursting. "Then we'll fill this house. And we'll love them fiercely and protect them as best we can, and if the worst happens, we'll survive it together, just like we've survived everything else." By summer, Penelope was pregnant. She glowed with it, all her earlier terror transmuted into fierce joy. Wade hovered anxiously until she laughingly banished him from the house, telling him to go work the ranch and stop treating her like spun glass. "I carried a child before," she reminded him. "I know what to expect. But that was different. That was before." Wade couldn't articulate what he meant, but Penelope seemed to understand. "That was before I had you," she agreed. "And yes, that makes all the difference. But Wade, you must let me do this without treating me as though I might shatter. I am stronger than you think." She proved it daily, working the ranch alongside him despite morning sickness and fatigue. Martha visited regularly, the two women forming a close friendship that Wade was grateful for. Sheriff Cooper stopped by to check on them, revealing a paternal side Wade hadn't expected. "You've done well," the sheriff said one afternoon, watching Penelope in the garden while Wade mended tack. "Both of you. When you first brought her to town, I thought it would end in disaster. I'm glad to be proven wrong." "I'm glad too," Wade admitted. "She saved my life in a way. Gave me a reason to be better than I was. And you gave her a reason to live again. That's not nothing, Wade." Sheriff Cooper clapped him on the shoulder. "You've become a good man. Not respectable, maybe, but good. There's a difference." Word came in September that the Morrison boys had moved on to Colorado, chasing gold rumors. Wade felt a weight lift from his shoulders, one less thing to worry about. The town's attitude toward him had shifted subtly over the past year. He was still the dangerous man everyone handled carefully, but now he was also Penelope's husband, Martha's friend, the rancher who'd helped recover stolen cattle from a neighboring spread. Grudging acceptance, if not quite respect. Penelope's time came in late October, a month earlier than expected. Wade rode for Martha and the midwife in a panic, his heart hammering with all the things that could go wrong. He'd been in gunfights without this level of fear. The labor was long and difficult, and Wade paced outside the bedroom door like a caged animal, flinching at every cry from Penelope. Sheriff Cooper had come with Martha and sat with Wade through the endless hours, providing silent support. When the baby's cry finally split the air, Wade nearly collapsed with relief. Martha opened the door, her face tired but smiling. "You have a son, Wade, and your wife is asking for you." He burst into the room to find Penelope propped up in bed, exhausted and radiant, holding a tiny bundle. Wade approached slowly, reverently, and looked down at his son's red, squalling face. "He is perfect," Penelope said, tears of joy streaming down her face. "Perfectly healthy and perfectly loud, just like his father." Wade touched the baby's tiny hand, marveling when fingers closed around his calloused thumb. "He's so small. He will grow." Penelope held the baby out to Wade. "Hold your son." Wade had never held an infant in his life, but he took the child carefully, cradling him against his chest. The baby quieted immediately, dark eyes blinking up at him with unfocused curiosity. Something in Wade's chest cracked open completely, a love so fierce it was almost painful flooding through him. "What should we call him?" Penelope asked. Wade thought about all the years of violence and loneliness, all the second chances he'd never thought he'd get. "William, after my mother's father, the only man in my family who was ever kind. William Zimmer." Penelope smiled. "It suits him." Over the next weeks, Wade learned the particular terror of fatherhood. Every cry sent him running. Every fever convinced him disaster was imminent. But Penelope, who'd walked through her own worst nightmare, remained calm and steady, teaching him how to change diapers and warm milk and rock a fussy baby at 2 in the morning. "You are hovering again," she told him one night, finding him watching William sleep for the 10th time in an hour. "I can't help it. He's so small, and there are so many things that could go wrong." Penelope came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist and leaning her head against his back. "I know. I wake up sometimes convinced he has stopped breathing, and I have to check before I can return to sleep. But we cannot live in fear, Wade. We must trust that he is strong, just as we have become strong. What if I'm a terrible father? What if I have my father's temper, his violence?" "You are nothing like your father." Penelope turned him to face her. "Your father hurt those weaker than himself. You defend them. Your father taught cruelty. You teach gentleness, even though you are still learning it yourself." She kissed him softly. "You will make mistakes, as all parents do. But you will love him, and that is what matters most." Wade held her close, this woman who had wandered into a saloon and changed his entire life. "I love you. I don't say it enough, but I do. You and William are everything to me. I know." She smiled against his chest. "And I love you, you rough, wonderful, impossible man. You taught me to laugh again. You gave me a reason to feel again. You made me believe that loss is not the end of the story." Winter that year was harsh, with heavy snows that kept them close to the house for weeks at a time. But inside, the small ranch house was warm with firelight and laughter. William grew fat and healthy, and Wade discovered he had a talent for making his son giggle that delighted everyone. "You are ridiculous," Penelope informed him, watching Wade making exaggerated faces at William. "Absolutely ridiculous. He loves it. Look at him laugh. He is 3 months old. He would laugh at a dust mote." But she was smiling, that full, genuine smile that Wade had learned to treasure. Martha visited when the weather allowed, bringing her own infant daughter. The two women would sit for hours, talking about everything and nothing while their babies played on blankets spread before the fire. Wade and Sheriff Cooper would smoke on the porch, discussing town politics and ranch business. Two unlikely friends brought together by their wives. "Never thought I'd see the day," Pete from the saloon remarked one afternoon when Wade came into town. Wade Zimmer, settled down with a family. Hell might actually freeze over. It's not so bad, Wade admitted, surprising himself. Turns out there's more to life than whiskey and fighting. You're making the rest of us look bad, Pete complained, but he was grinning. Next thing I know, you'll be attending church socials. Let's not get crazy. Wade purchased his supplies and headed home, eager to return to Penelope and William. The ride that had once felt like freedom now felt like distance between him and everything that mattered. He found Penelope in the garden, William strapped to her back in a sling she'd fashioned, showing him the early spring plants pushing through the soil. She looked up at Wade's approach, her face lighting up in a way that still made his heart stutter. "Your son has been very helpful today," she announced. "He provided valuable commentary on the carrots." "Did he now?" Wade dismounted and kissed first Penelope, then William's downy head. "What did he say?" "Nothing intelligible, but he was very enthusiastic." She leaned into Wade, and they stood together in the garden, the three of them, their own small, perfect world. Years passed in a blur of seasons and milestones. William learned to walk, to talk, to ride perched in front of Wade on Trouble's broad back. 2 years after William, Penelope gave birth to a daughter they named Mary after Penelope's mother. Then came another son, Thomas, and finally another daughter, Elizabeth. The house they'd added onto twice now rang with children's laughter and arguments and tears. Wade learned patience he'd never known he possessed, how to soothe nightmares and mend broken toys and explain why hitting was wrong even when you were angry. Penelope bloomed in motherhood, her earlier grief transformed into fierce protectiveness and abundant love. "You remember when we met?" she asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching their children chase fireflies in the dusk. William was 10 now, Mary 8, Thomas 5, and Elizabeth 3. "When I walked into that saloon looking for work, I remember thinking you looked like you'd given up on everything," Wade said, pulling her closer, "like you were just going through motions." "I was. I had convinced myself that surviving was enough, that I did not deserve anything more." She watched William show Elizabeth how to cup her hands to catch the glowing insects. "And then you offered me a job and a home and a reason to care again. You did the same for me." "I was heading nowhere good before you showed up." Wade kissed her temple. "You softened me, Penelope, taught me I could be strong without being cruel. And you taught me to laugh again, to feel again, to believe that joy after grief was possible." She turned to kiss him properly, a kiss full of promise and memory and love so deep it had become the foundation of everything they'd built. "Thank you, Wade, for seeing past the broken woman in the saloon to who I could become. Thank you for seeing past the rough cowboy to who I wanted to be." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their children play until Mary ran up the porch steps. "Papa, William said I can't learn to shoot because I am a girl. Tell him he is wrong." Wade suppressed a smile. His daughter had inherited her mother's determination and his stubbornness, a formidable combination. "He's wrong. Tomorrow we'll start your lessons." "Really?" Mary's face lit up exactly like Penelope's did. "Really? Your mother's an excellent shot and you'll be too." Wade ruffled her hair. "Now go tell your brother that Papa said girls can do anything boys can do, only better." Mary ran off whooping, and Penelope laughed. "You are going to regret encouraging her, probably, but she should know how to defend herself and her family." Wade pulled Penelope onto his lap, something he still did regularly despite her protests about being too old for such things. "Besides, I like having dangerous women around. Keeps life interesting." "Dangerous women?" Penelope raised an eyebrow. "I am a respectable rancher's wife and mother of 4. You're the woman who walked into the roughest saloon in Owyhee and demanded a job with no experience and no fear. That's dangerous in the best way. She kissed him again, deeper this time, and Wade felt the same rush of love and desire he'd felt that first day in the garden when she'd cried in his arms. Some things, he'd learned, only grew stronger with time. The children grew as children do. William became a fine horseman. Tom showed a talent for working with cattle. Mary proved to be the best shot of all of them, and Elizabeth had a way with the garden that surpassed even her mother's skill. The ranch prospered. Wade's reputation transformed from dangerous outlaw to tough but fair rancher to simply Wade Zimmer, good neighbor and devoted father. He never completely lost his rough edges. He still had a temper, still occasionally got into fights when pushed too far, still scared people who didn't know him well. But Penelope was always there to balance him, to remind him with a look or a touch that he was more than his worst impulses. And Wade taught her to laugh, every single day. He learned what made her giggle, what made her chortle, what made her throw back her head and roar with genuine mirth. He collected her laughter like precious gems, treasuring each instance as proof that they'd both survived their darkness and found their way to light. On their 10th anniversary, Wade took Penelope back to Owyhee, to the Silver Strike saloon where they'd met. Pete was still behind the bar, grayer but still ornery. "Well, look at this," Pete said, grinning at them. "The most unlikely success story in Nevada history." "We're here to thank you," Penelope said, surprising Pete. "If you had not left that bottle on the bar, Wade might not have stayed long enough for me to arrive. We owe our happiness to your whiskey and your wisdom." Pete actually looked embarrassed. "Wasn't wisdom, madam. Was just trying to keep him from fighting the Morrison boys that day." "Nevertheless," Penelope set a pie on the bar. "Apple, your favorite, Martha told me." They stayed for one drink, toasting the past and the future, then rode home in the golden afternoon light. Their children would be waiting, probably having driven the neighbor's daughter Wade had hired to watch them half crazy with their energy. The house would be chaos, dinner would be late, and someone would definitely need settling before bed. Wade couldn't wait. "Happy?" Penelope asked as they rode side by side, comfortable in the saddle after years of practice. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Wade admitted. "You, deliriously happy. Exhausted and covered in dirt and wondering how Elizabeth got jam in her hair when we had no jam at breakfast, but happy." She reached across the space between their horses to take his hand. "Thank you for the life we have built, Wade. Thank you for being exactly who you are. Thank you for making me want to be better than I was." Wade squeezed her hand. "I love you, Penelope Zimmer. More today than yesterday and less than tomorrow." That is remarkably poetic for a rough cowboy. I've been practicing. Had to match my wife's fancy Philadelphia education somehow. Her laughter rang out across the desert, bright and clear and full of joy. Wade listened to it and thought about the empty woman who'd walked into a saloon 10 years ago, and the angry man who'd offered her a job for no good reason he could name. Two broken people who'd found each other in the hardest place at the hardest time, and somehow made something beautiful. The years continued to pass, bringing their share of hardships and heartbreak. They lost cattle to drought one year, and the roof caved in during a particularly harsh winter. Thomas broke his arm falling from a horse, and Mary gave them all a scare when she disappeared for a day, having ridden too far chasing cattle and gotten turned around in the desert. Wade's knuckles grew more scarred from ranch work than fighting, and Penelope's hands became work roughened despite her best efforts. But through it all, they had each other. When Wade's temper flared, Penelope was there to cool it with a touch and a quiet word. When Penelope's grief for her lost daughter and first husband rose up unexpectedly, Wade held her through the tears and reminded her that loving again wasn't betrayal. They taught each other, daily, how to be better humans. Their children grew into good people, which Wade privately thought was a miracle given his rough parenting and Penelope's learning as she went approach. William married a neighbor's daughter and started his own ranch nearby. Mary shocked everyone by becoming a deputy sheriff, the first woman in the county to hold the position. Thomas took over more and more of the ranch operations as Wade's back began to protest the harder work. Elizabeth went east to study, then returned to teach school in Owyhee. "We did well," Penelope said one evening as they celebrated William's first child, their first grandchild, a boy named Wade after his grandfather. "We did," Wade agreed, holding the infant with the same terrified reverence he'd shown with his own children. "Though I'm still not sure how. We loved them. We loved each other. Sometimes that is enough." Sheriff Cooper had retired years ago, replaced by a younger man who'd grown up hearing stories about Wade Zimmer and treated him with cautious respect. Martha Cooper and Penelope had remained best friends through everything, their children growing up together, their lives woven into an intricate pattern of shared history. Pete sold the Silver Strike Saloon and moved into a small house in town, where Penelope insisted on bringing him dinner twice a week because he helped us find each other. The ladies' auxiliary eventually apologized to Penelope for their initial judgment, though it took 15 years and undeniable proof of the Zimmers' solid marriage and fine children. Wade accepted the apologies with his usual gruffness, but Penelope was gracious in victory. She even joined the ladies' auxiliary, much to Wade's amusement, and spent her time advocating for widows and women in difficult circumstances, making sure no one else felt as desperate as she once had. On their 25th anniversary, their children threw them a party that seemed to involve half of Owyhee. Wade stood at the edge of the celebration, watching Penelope laugh with Martha and their daughters, watching his sons argue good-naturedly about cattle, watching grandchildren race between adults' legs. "You look thoughtful," Penelope said, appearing at his elbow with 2 glasses of punch. "Just thinking about how different life could have been, if you hadn't walked into that saloon, if I hadn't offered you a job, if we hadn't been brave enough to try. Do you have regrets?" she asked, studying his face. "Not a single one." Wade took the punch but set it aside to pull her into his arms instead. "You were the best thing that ever happened to me, Penelope. You took a rough, angry man and taught him how to love. You were not as rough as you thought, and you already knew how to love. You had simply forgotten." She rested her head on his chest, fitting perfectly after all these years. "But you taught me something even more important. You taught me that laughter after grief is not betrayal. That joy after loss is not disrespect to what came before. You taught me to live again, Wade, not just survive." They danced slowly while their family celebrated around them. 2 people who'd found each other in the hardest way and made a life neither could have imagined. The rough cowboy who'd needed softening and the broken woman who'd forgotten how to laugh, building something lasting from their shared wounds. "I love you," Wade whispered into her hair. "Every day I love you more. And I love you, my rough, wonderful, impossible man, my best friend, my husband, the father of my children, and the reason I smile every single day." The party continued late into the night, but eventually everyone went home and it was just the 2 of them again, sitting on their porch under a blanket of stars. The desert stretched away in all directions, vast and harsh and beautiful, the same desert that had witnessed their first awkward conversations and now watched them in comfortable silence. "Tell me something," Penelope said suddenly. "That day in the saloon, why did you really offer me a job? You could have let me leave, let me be someone else's problem. Wade thought about it, really thought about it, trying to trace back to the man he'd been a quarter century ago. I saw something in your eyes, something I recognized from my own mirror. That look of someone who'd given up but was still somehow standing. He paused, searching for words. And I think maybe I wanted to save you because no one had ever saved me. Maybe I wanted to prove that broken people could help other broken people, that we weren't all beyond redemption. You did save me, Penelope said softly. You absolutely saved me. And you saved me right back. Wade kissed the top of her head. We saved each other. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead, holding hands like teenagers. Tomorrow would bring work and challenges and the everyday struggles of life, but tonight was perfect. Wade, Penelope's voice was drowsy. Will you teach our grandchildren to laugh the way you taught me? Every single one of them, Wade promised. And I'll teach them to be strong like their grandmother, and kind like their mother, and brave enough to love even when it's scary. And I'll teach them to be gentle like their grandfather, even when the world tells them to be hard. I'll teach them that the roughest exterior can hide the softest heart, Wade chuckled. Are you calling me soft? Absolutely. You are the softest man I know under all that leather and stubble and fierce protectiveness. She yawned. Take me to bed, husband. I am exhausted from all this celebrating. Wade stood and lifted her into his arms, something he'd done 1,000 times and would do 1,000 more if his back allowed it. She laughed and protested and held on tight, her arms around his neck, her face pressed to his shoulder. He carried her inside, past the photographs on the wall documenting their life together, past the worn furniture they'd purchased piece by piece as they could afford it, past the toys scattered from grandchildren's visits. He carried her to their room and laid her gently on the bed they'd shared for 25 years. I love you, Penelope Zimmer, he said, pulling off his boots. Tomorrow and every day after that. I love you, Wade Zimmer, she replied, already half asleep. My rough cowboy who taught me to laugh again. Wade lay down beside her and pulled her close, feeling her breathing even out as she drifted to sleep. He stayed awake a while longer, counting his blessings in the form of sleeping wife, grown children, healthy grandchildren, a life built from nothing but determination and love. He thought about the angry young man he'd been, sure he was beyond saving, convinced his rough edges made him unworthy of anything soft or good. He thought about the broken woman who'd walked into a saloon with $17 and no hope, looking for work in all the wrong places. And he thought about how they'd found each other in the darkness and decided to build toward the light, how she'd softened his sharp edges while he'd reminded her what joy sounded like, how they'd created a family and a home and a legacy of love from the ruins of their separate tragedies. It hadn't been easy. It had been hard work and compromise and learning to communicate and forgive and try again every single day. But it had been worth it. God, it had been worth it. Wade fell asleep with Penelope in his arms, a smile on his weathered face, grateful for saloons and desperate decisions, and the courage it took to offer help to a stranger. Grateful for second chances and laughter after tears and the way love could heal even the deepest wounds. The desert night wrapped around their small ranch house, cradling the family sleeping within, keeping watch over the rough cowboy and the woman who'd loved him into gentleness, the woman who'd forgotten how to laugh until he'd reminded her it was possible. Their story had started in the hardest way, in a saloon full of rough men and broken dreams. But it had become something beautiful, something lasting, something that would echo through their children and grandchildren and generations to come. A reminder that rough people could be softened, broken people could learn to laugh again, and love, real love, could transform everything. And in the morning, They would wake up together as they had every morning for 25 years and start another day of their impossible, improbable, absolutely perfect life.